Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to call to order the Committee of the Whole meeting for the TNRD on Friday, April 23rd, 2021. First matter we have to deal with is the adoption of the minutes from the February 19th, 2021 meeting.
So moved.
Moved, seconded. Is there any discussion? No discussion? All in favor? Opposed, if any? It's carried. That brings us to reports, and the first report is a report from our Director of Finance dealing with the COVID-19 Safe Restart Grant Funds. And I expect we'll hear from Mr. Ray on that one. There is a recommendation. Perhaps we can deal with a recommendation once we've heard from Mr. Ray.
Yeah, this was really just to further the conversation that was started before. And as you know, we've received additional funds compared to the last time we were speaking about it. I don't know if the CAO wants to expand a little bit on some of the recommendations in the report.
Yeah, thank you, Doug, and thank you, Chair Gillis. So as you know, I believe we have a kind of approved part of that 1.376 total funding. There was $100,000 towards electoral areas. There was $385,000 towards IT related backbone and internal upgrades. And then there was $150,000 towards PPE equipment for our fire departments, leaving the remaining $741,000 yet to be determined. We felt it would be a great opportunity for us to put this topic on the agenda for the Committee of the Whole meeting today and try to get some direction from the board on where we would like to invest and spend the rest of that funding. We did, as Doug mentioned, suggest a couple of ideas, three in fact, $150,000 more to the electoral areas, which would give them $25,000 each. $100,000 towards potential economic development services, which could be a variety of things. We put the multi-purpose meeting space / boardroom in there again as it was originally for discussion. And then there was $79,000 left over. That was other regional support is where we landed. But of course, all of this will be a discussion of the board and a decision of the board.
Thanks. Mr. Hildebrand, I'm just wondering, there was another grant that you were looking at for the construction of a new multi-purpose meeting room, and I'm just wondering, have we heard anything at all about that grant?
Thank you, Chair Gillis, for that reminder, and I meant to mention that is we just haven't heard yet. The answer we received back was we'll hear in spring, so we will hear, I would think, within the next few weeks. Which will help us to further that discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have it though.
Okay, so I understand then in the meantime, it'd be your recommendation that we would hold this $412,000 reserve in so that we can deal with this in the event that the second grant does not come through.
Correct.
Thank you. Okay, is there any discussion with, well, first we have a recommendation. I suppose we should deal with the recommendations. Does somebody care to move them?
I'll move the recommendation.
Second is no. Is there any discussion with respect to the recommendations? Director Schaefer.
The 79,000 other regional supports, could you give me an idea what that means, what it involves?
Director Schaefer, it was simply a placeholder right now. The one idea that I had was things similar to the DER3 project that we did and other regional type economic development opportunities. But other than that, we wanted to leave it up to the board to come up with some ideas and some direction.
Director Rothenberger.
Thanks very much. Just a question on what's included in the list that we've got so far. I'm curious about possible assistance to fire brigades and whether that would be included in the amount that's already tentatively designated for electoral areas, or and it would come out of that, or whether there's consideration for a separate pool of funding for that, or a separate, you know, bit of money for them from the rest of what's available.
Mr. Hildebrand?
Yeah, that was certainly an idea that we thought about, and I guess our thought was it may be included in that 25,000, and each EA director could make that decision. But again, a lot of this is just placeholders and ideas to get the conversation started. So we are certainly open to anything that fits within the envelope of the requirements of the funding.
Director Elliott?
I would like to know the process by which we get to dole out this kind of money.
Mr. Ray?
I did have a brief discussion with Ms. Campbell on that very topic because, again, it hadn't been necessarily laid out specifically. In terms, we spoke mainly about the amounts that had been allocated to the electoral area directors. And the question was whether it had to come back to the board and have each individual expenditure approved by the board as a whole. And we felt that the allocation to the electoral area directors was the intent was that the individual directors would allow them to direct staff as to how they wanted it to be used without requiring a motion from the board as a whole for each one. Beyond that, I think it's a matter of if you bring things forward, I'll do a bit of an assessment to make sure I don't see anything that looks like it's contrary to the intent of the province and the criteria they've laid out for the use of the funds to keep everyone, on board with that criteria.
If I may, Mr. Chairman,
Yes, please.
I can't never get this thing to work. So Mr. Ray, if we came to you with a list and the amounts we'd like to provide the people on that list, you would go over it and then cut the check for that organization?
That would be my understanding of how it should work, unless, the board decides that they would rather see a different process.
Well, to my way of thinking, that's the only way it could be. That way we keep it above board and everybody knows where the money went. And I'm quite comfortable with that scenario. So I can make sure that you get a list. And when will we be able to do that?
Well, for the funds that are currently allocated, it could be now, and certainly depending on further allocations that arise out of this discussion, there could be additional amounts. I will just add, in terms of transparency and accountability, just like I do with the other discretionary funds that the directors provide me with direction on how to spend, I would intend to do a report on how the money was spent after the fact as a public report, just to make sure everyone, that even after the fact, there's clear accountability and transparency around how the money is used. And it just helps everyone to understand how it was used, and it helps keep the information, sharing it with other board members too.
Thank you, Mr. Ray. I appreciate that.
Mr. Hildebrand?
Just to further that, I meant to mention this earlier as well, as Katie sent out to the electoral areas, and I believe to the entire board, a list of some of the past investments we've made within the electoral areas. It was in your electronic blue folder. Just a list of things that within each electoral area, some of the areas that may make sense to look at just as ideas. And just a separate topic, if I may, I know we have a number of people that want to speak on the screen. Yesterday, I noticed when the backgrounds are light, you can barely see, like I'm looking at Director Rain right now, you can barely see the yellow hand. So feel free to wave too. We just don't want to miss you. And I know Director Singh is sending me text messages to keep me informed on who's waiting on the list. So we'll do our best to help make sure we watch for everybody. Yeah, so right now I've got Directors Bass, Rain, Brown, and Sinclair that have their hands up. Chair Gillis.
Thank you for that. So let's start with Director Bass.
Blackwell as well.
No, I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, okay, then Director Rain.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually have several concerns with the recommendation, and not in the recommendation itself, but and one of my concerns is that it is very clear from the province's guidelines that these are COVID-related eligible costs, and they address revenue shortfalls, facility reopenings, emergency planning and response, bylaw enforcement protection services, computer and electronic technology costs, services for vulnerable people, and related costs related to COVID. I just wanted to make sure that I believe that in allocating these funds, there should be an acknowledgement that the funds can only be spent for the eligible COVID-related costs as outlined by the province. And I'm very concerned when Director of Finance says this is kind of like discretionary funds. This is not like discretionary funds. This is clearly and specifically identified for COVID-related. And I'm also concerned when you say then the directors in the electoral areas would have full discretion on how the funds are spent. I think we need to add something to that. The other concern I have here is we have the issue of the electoral areas, and in fact, in reading this recommendation, this is like a federal government trick on an omnibus bill. You give everybody a little bit of money, and then you tuck in a couple things that are poison pills, and you say, okay, now vote on it. The vote here should be separated into 3 different votes, in my estimation. The funds going to the electoral area, the reserve for construction, and then the regional support and the pooled economic development could be lumped into one other motion. So that if I'm opposed to putting the funds aside for the multipurpose meeting building, I don't have to vote against giving additional funding to the electoral areas. And this is all lumped into one package, take it or leave it. I think we really should split these up. And then the last thing on the multipurpose meeting space, I mean, I still, maybe I've been asleep at the switch, but I haven't seen the business case for actually doing this. We have a grant in, and we're now recommending putting some funding aside. And I don't mind doing that, except for I'd say this should be subject to presentation to the board and subsequently approved by the board. There needs to be a business case to show that this really is wise and good spending of the public dollars. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Rain. And I had actually meant to mention, following Director Ray's comments, that all of this is contingent in respect to Director Elliott's questions. All of this is contingent on those expenditures being COVID related and fitting within the criteria as outlined by the province relating to these recovery grants. So I think that's understood, is it not, Mr. Ray?
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I think I did make a comment that as part of the process, I would review those criteria and make sure that the proposed expenditures did meet that criteria.
Thank you. With respect to your suggestion, Director Rain, that we vote on recommendations number 1 and number 3 and 2 and 4 together, does anyone have any objection? I'm perfectly prepared to go with that. It makes sense to me. Does anyone have any objections to that? Okay, that's Director Elliott.
Mr. Chairman, number 2 is pooled economic development service, to which I don't believe we have at this point. I could be mistaken, but I might have missed something, but what would we spend $100,000 on?
Director Ray?
Yeah, we do have one service that is an economic development service that all members of the TNRD, all areas contribute money to, although we haven't taxed for that service in a number of years because it's had a small amount of surplus funds and we've just been slowly whittling away at it. An example, in the past, we used some of it to develop some of that website for the different areas that we were maintaining for a few years to help promote economic development in those areas. And that was just basically spending the money that we had in the bank already. So
Was that money the money that came from venture camps originally?
I don't know the source of the original surplus. It's
I
been there
think,
longer than I have.
Maybe the director from the city of Kamloops might have an answer to that. But we got money after we came out of venture Kamloops, put it in a bank. It was supposed to be for some internal economic development. And one of the things we talked about was some information, things over at the airport. So I don't know whether that ever happened or not. But that 200,000 has been sitting there for at least 5 or 6 years. And why on earth would we add to it?
Director Christian?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And further to Director Elliott's point, yeah, when I was looking at that, I was thinking of what are regional economic development initiatives. One is Venture Kamloops, because while they're centered in Kamloops, they do look at the region as a whole and market that way. And the other two are the Film Commission, which is, TNRD operated, but definitely has an impact on Kamloops and the rest of the region. And the final one, as you mentioned, is the Kamloops Airport Authority Society, which Director Kershaw is our representative on, and that's really a regional service. So any one of those three, I think, would be a good place to park that.
Thanks. Director Brown?
My understanding is that this money is used for services for for the local government, TNRD. It is not meant to provide to individuals or societies for their losses. It is meant for services that we already have and were impacted by COVID. And I worry that if we start handing it out to societies and people that have been hard hit, that it may not be eligible. We were told that we should not be giving it to societies or individuals. There are many streams available for societies and individuals and local business to apply for funding. This is for services that TNRD is providing. And I think that, to me, is where we need to look at. And it's probably a good idea to vote in the way that Director Rain has suggested. I don't have a problem with doing it either way, but I do have a problem with some of the individuals that are expecting, I guess, to get money to send around to individuals. I think we have to keep it as to services that the TNRD is currently supporting.
Thanks, Director Brown. I'm wondering if Ms. Campbell can elaborate on that. Is it restricted to local government services, or is it open to being distributed to various societies, charities, whatever, that have been hard hit by COVID?
Mr. Chair, I might direct this to Mr. Ray to speak on. I think he's a bit more familiar with the eligibility criteria.
Thank you, Director Ray.
Thank you. For the most part, I agree with Director Brown's comments. The intent of the funds are for the local government to provide services that the local government itself provides. where it might have encountered funding issues due to COVID, such as, a lot of local governments run a recreation facility that rely heavily on drop-in fees, things of that nature, and where those revenues have fallen off and they still have fixed costs. It was meant to cover off some issues like that. But there's a number of things that they've included in there. And one of the things in the letter from the ministry included funding third parties, societies who provide services to the general public, especially, in the case of vulnerable persons, homeless shelters and missions that provide meals and things of that nature that, obviously would incur significant increased cost to try and create a safe environment with proper social distancing and so forth. So there is a bit of a crack open of the door to provide it to other parties. I think we have to be careful about what services they're providing. I do worry a little bit about the process if societies are coming forward and pleading that they have a shortfall in revenues, what the expectation is of staff to verify that. Does it become quite a complex and convoluted grant process that, frankly, we don't necessarily have staffing resources to accommodate? So I think we have to be careful in that regard. I do know, having talked to some of the other regional districts, the one example that stands out in my mind was the Caribou Regional District, where they provided grants to community halls in their areas that had, a significant shortfall of revenues and still fixed costs. And they wanted to ensure that there was some assistance provided because those community halls provided an important community service, and they wanted to make sure they were still around once COVID was finished. So I can certainly foresee instances like that that might be applicable.
And do you know, Mr. Ray, whether the inclusion of community halls was found to be acceptable by the powers that be in Victoria? Did anybody check that out?
I haven't heard anything to the contrary. In a few weeks' time, there's a GFOA, Government Financial Officers BC conference coming up, and that was one of the questions that I was going to bring forward to the group at that virtual conference, was to again get some updated information on how other regional districts are using these funds and whether there's been any feedback from the ministry on any of that.
Thank you. I happen to know that community halls are taking a terrible hit as a result of COVID. So I'm keenly interested in the answer to that question. Mr. Hildebrand.
If I could just add to that, I have heard of examples in other regional districts where community halls, as well as just emergency services, fire departments, are being included in the funding.
Thank you. Director Sinclair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add my voice to Director Brown and Director Rain. I think we need some more rigor around this process. And as a board, we are collectively responsible for financial oversight. And I'm not comfortable with the current proposal where we're perhaps giving each area an equal amount. I need to see the cases for the needs for support. There may be one area that has been harder hit than others. And when I look at the list of organizations received by email, organizations and services and community halls and that sort of thing, they all look worthy, but I don't see any further detail. And I don't want to be approving or signing off on something after the fact. I think it's important for the board to see where the funding is going, because we're accountable for this and we need to report on this at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Sinclair. Director Blackwell.
Yeah, thanks. My comments have been, I'll just reinforce Director St. Clair and Director Rain's comments. I agree with that. That's the gist of my thoughts.
Thank you, Director Watson.
Thank you. I just wanted to answer the Mayor of Kamloops' suggestion that Venture Kamloops actually works for anything but Kamloops. That is why we got out of Venture Kamloops. They did not work for anybody but Kamloops. And I would really hesitate to ever darken their doorways again.
Director Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Somehow I have managed not to see my list, but I can tell you that the electoral areas are not like the cities. We have small municipalities that have small societies that do the work of many municipalities. And I, for one, think that although the board may be ultimately responsible, if I set out for my area some COVID updates for the people who have lost money in the last 15 months, I think it's imperative for the financial officer to tell me if I'm right or wrong. And my opinion should account for most of that. And I don't want to see a whole bunch of people telling me that my area doesn't require COVID money. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that we have to rely to a great extent on Mr. Ray's discretion, and as I understand the process, every application from an electoral director would be subject to Mr. Ray's ultimate approval or disapproval, and that would be done with a view to keeping the COVID-19 criteria in mind. Is that not correct? Thanks, Mr. Hildebrand. And you wish to speak as well?
Yeah, that would be my thought as well. I just, Director Singh has been passing me along kind of the hands going up. So just to assist you, Chair Gillis, I've got the order he sent me was Rice, Stamer, Bass, Roden, Rothenberger, Smith, and Kershaw. They're on the list just to help you out.
Rice, Steamer, Bass. I'm writing as quickly as I can.
After Bass was Roden, and then Rothenberger,
Yep.
Smith, and Kershaw.
Thank you. Okay, Director Rice.
You're on mute, Steve.
Off on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes,
Okay. I echo what Director Elliott said. Although there are some things we can identify now, COVID is unfolding as we speak. We can identify things that are moving in rural areas that may be affected down the road. So it would be very hard to put a plan together for my electoral area as far as where COVID related funding needed to go at this point. I could identify a couple of places, and I think I'm comfortable letting Doug Ray, Director of Finance, vet them and make sure they meet the provincial, sort of guidelines that have been set down. And that being said, as we know, all municipalities got in the several $100,000 range. The city of Kamloops, I'm sure, got in the $1 million range of funding from this COVID restart funding. Electoral areas got zero. And we need to find a way to inject some funding into our 10 electoral areas and hit these rural areas and pieces of rural that have been hit hard, whether it's a community hall or a homeless shelter or whatever. They're all here in these rural areas. And we, as Director Elliott has stated, know better than anybody what's needed and who needs it. And if Doug Ray says it's not qualified, it's not qualified. That's the vetting process and stuff like that. So I have no problem with that. What I do have a problem with, however, is how do you get COVID restart funding? And I still say it was a bad idea from the beginning to justify it, to connect to building a better and bigger boardroom with arguments like it's a source of income for the TNRD. Other entities can use it. We need that bigger space and stuff like that. I still have a hard time when the headline comes out, TNRD uses COVID restart money to build a bigger, better boardroom. I don't get it. I don't even understand why it was considered. And that part of this proposal, I adamantly oppose. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that we've established that we will be voting and debating 1, 3 individually and recommendations 2 and 4 together. So you will have the opportunity to speak if you have more to say on that topic, Mr. Rice. Director Stamer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with what almost everything has been said as Director Blackwell alluded to, but there's a couple things I wanted to ask Mr. Ray about. First of all, when it talks about these deadlines, it says must be fully allocate the grant funds by December 31st. I understood it was December 31st, 2022. And the second thing is what are the other regional districts doing? I am very sympathetic to the electoral area needs because it is unfortunate they didn't receive any COVID funds directly like we did. And Director Rice brings up a good point about the boardroom. That's another thing, another discussion to talk about. But isn't that true? Doesn't it go to December 31st, 2022? Can't we park more of this money and see how things unfold?
Mr. Ray.
My recollection from the letter, and I'm just looking at it to see if I can find that particular.
I was pretty sure, I was pretty sure from our perspective, from municipally, I thought we had till December 2022 to park it. And there could also be some changes in what is eligible and what isn't eligible by that.
So on page 3 of the letter from the ministry, the first one we received November 2nd, 2020, at the very top of the letter, it says, before December 31st, 2021, a little over a year from this letter, the regional board must fully allocate the grant funds to the appropriate services. This allocation will be entirely at the discretion of the board. Ministry staff are available to assist. However, the expectation is that we don't necessarily have to have it all spent by the end of 2021. They anticipate the spending to incur chiefly 2021 and 2022.
Okay.
We have to have the funds allocated by the end of 2021.
Okay, so we thank you for that. So we still have time, but we have to disperse the funds by 2022.
Well, and even beyond that, they've said that there's no deadline specifically. They just expect most of the funding to be spent in 2021 and 2022, but they haven't said they must be spent by the end of 2022, but they must be allocated. In other words, we have to have an idea of which services these funds are going to be directed towards and an intent for how they'll be used by the end of this year. But then we have a longer period of time over which to actually spend them.
Yes, thank you. And what are the other regional districts doing? Are they in the same situation as we are?
Yes, I mean, they provide, there's definitely differences. Some of them aren't as geographically broad as we are, and they have much less rural area in some of them. They offer different services. I know some of them do operate recreation facilities, and those have provided significant challenges to them. They're putting a lot of money towards those. We at the TNRD don't operate anything like that. We're in partnership with some of our municipalities that do. And in the sense that we often have agreements in place to pay a certain amount of tax money towards those services each year in recognition of the fact that the electoral area residents make use of those facilities. But we're not in the same position. We don't own significant facilities that rely heavily on user fees as opposed to property tax base.
Right. Thanks for that.
Director Bass.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak on what Councillor or Director Sinclair talked about. And it just seems to me this is no disrespect to the electoral directors or to Mr. Ray, but we're in a time where our transparency and accountability are under a microscope. And I also would like to see things and see see the cases behind them, because I think the public needs to see it as well, to see what we're doing and how we're spending a lot of money. So I just wanted to back up Director Sinclair on that.
Thank you. Director Roden. You're on mute, Director Roden.
There we go. I haven't had enough coffee this morning. Regarding the electoral areas and community, my reading of it was that you can, as Director Ray said, provide funding to third-party organizations which provide services which have been affected by COVID, not businesses, obviously. The electoral area community I'm most familiar with is Spence's Bridge. And I think one of the issues in some of the electoral area small communities is that a lot of the groups that provide these services, whether it's lunches or soup kitchens or drop-in centers or what have you, unlike in some of the municipalities, they are not formal organizations. They do not have charitable status or nonprofit status. They are ad hoc volunteer groups. So yes, I agree that there is a fair bit of money sloshing around out there for organizations. If you look at the fine print, they do tend to be for groups that are registered charities or nonprofits. So a lot of our more ad hoc throughout the TNRD wouldn't qualify for any of that funding. When it comes to transparency, I agree we need to be transparent, but there comes a point when we must trust to people like Director Ray and the electoral area directors to know what is best for their communities, what fits and what doesn't fit, and to make those decisions. If absolutely everything has to go under a microscope, goodness me, we're going to find it hard to get things done in a timely manner. And then regarding the boardroom, whether the money comes out of COVID funds or whether it comes out of general funds or whether we have a whip around with a hat, if there is a business case for constructing a new boardroom, then we need to construct a new boardroom. And I'll just point out that we are paying a fair bit of money every time we use the Sandman Center, which is a wonderful facility. But I know that in addition to the actual rental cost, it does cost a lot of staff time in schlepping everything down there and then schlepping everything back. And it's inconvenient for staff because they're not necessarily on site. So by all means, I'd like to see a business case. If we need to build a new boardroom, we need to build a new boardroom, and splitting hairs about where the funding comes from, I think just delays the inevitable. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Roden. Mr. Hildebrand, you wish to comment, and perhaps in your comments you could address the question of that Director Rice raised as to how the construction of a new meeting room is related to COVID.
Sure. Thanks, Chair Gillis. Just a quick reminder, if you could add Director Singh and Director O'Reilly to your list, that would be great. So first of all, I guess to start, I agree with Director Rain, Sinclair, and Bass and their comments about transparency. I'm sure the board can understand that there's 26 views out there. So when we put this together, we really wanted to have a discussion about this because I've received probably more than a dozen emails and conversations with directors on what they thought was the right way to go with our funding. Of course, we need to work within the criteria, but ultimately we need to come up with a consensus. To answer your question that Director Rice brought up, currently we do spend approximately $4,000 a month using this space. It certainly is inconvenient, but it's what we need to do during COVID, and it's worked very well, and we appreciate the space. Going forward, as we look at our facility, we are growing. We are running out of space on the 3rd floor and the 4th floor for staff, for meetings. And so the opportunity was using current space in the library on floor 2 to repurpose into a multi-space boardroom that we can use for library activities. We can use for external groups and committees to use the space, and then of course use it for a boardroom. It would be set up in a way that the IT equipment, the tables, the chairs can all be folded up. So it could also be used for venues of larger scale when we're able to do that. So, and of course, there could be a revenue generation as well. So when we put the case together for the grant, a lot of that was included, and we will be bringing that back to the board if that is desired. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, Mr. Hildebrand, the case that you put together for the other grant, would that, do you think that would qualify as a business plan as suggested by Director Rain?
I believe we need more, to add more to that. We kind of met the expectations of the grant. Because that room, as you kind of think back and as we use it now and spread ourselves out for committee meetings, having this group or the hospital board in that building is certainly tight. And that's the staff have talked about that a lot, that they feel it's been used well. But as we have more staff attending meetings, it is close quarters, and certainly something we thought we'd invest in the future, for the future.
Thank you. Ms. Campbell, you wish to comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to follow up on what Mr. Hildebrand was saying. I don't know if Mr. Ray encountered this in some of his research with other regional districts, but through some of my counterparts, I have learned that there are some regional districts that have also allocated their COVID funding to enhancements to their boardrooms. So enhancements to existing boardrooms, enhancements to meeting rooms. A few of them, it was a result of trying to increase public accessibility as part of their strategic plans, and making some enhancements to their technology to allow them to live stream their meetings. So I don't have an exact number, but it is certainly an expenditure that's been utilized by other regional districts as well.
Thank you. Director Rothenberger.
Some of my thoughts have been expressed by others, but I will say that if we interpret the eligibility criteria for this funding to exclude societies and apply it only to services that are directly operated by the TNRD, we're going to severely limit the usefulness of this funding to rural areas. Because probably even more than municipalities, we rely on these societies to provide a lot of the services that the TNRD does not provide and does not get involved in. So I think we need to retain that flexibility. And I don't interpret, and I'm just reading it like anybody else, but I don't interpret the criteria to be that restrictive. Community halls are an excellent example of that. I mean, they are really hurting right now, some of them. And if we say, well, you're not, we don't operate you, we don't own you, so, we don't think you're going to be eligible for this, that, that's a problem for them, because they are looking for some way to pay their bills. With respect to the process, if we make the process so clunky that EA directors suddenly have to be providing municipal directors with their lists of what they feel are the priorities in their areas, I think that's going to be another problem for the process, and is going to make it much less effective than it should be. But there's transparency and accountability that can be achieved if we simply kind of follow the same process we do for gas tax funding now. Why don't we just, when an EA director has a wish for the spending of some of this allotted funding, take it to the board and let the board approve it. I don't think there's ever been a case, at least not during my time, when the board has said, no, we don't like your idea. That you may think it's a good idea for your area, but it's not good enough for us, so we're going to turn you down. That doesn't happen. It's simply a matter of keeping everybody informed. I mean, that money, whether it be discretionary or gas tax funding, is distributed very conscientiously and carefully, and it's never abused. So I think the issue is simply making sure that everybody knows what's going on. So why don't we just do it that way instead of going through some pre-approved list that, as Director Sinclair suggests?
Thank you, Director Rothenberger. Director Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity. I think that many of the directors have already sort of echoed my thoughts as well. But I think one of the things that we need to remember is that if there is projects that have already been approved that happen to be eligible for this funding, and we use this funding towards some of those projects, it also frees up that funding for channeling into other places that we may not be able to actually use that funding for. And I think that I'd agree with Director Christian's comments with regard to economic development, and the Film Commission is talking about building a new studio. So I think that's a good economic development initiative for our region. And obviously the airport's going to probably need some assistance in some way. And I also, I do agree that we should be using some of those funds to assist groups and organizations that are doing good work in some of the small communities with vulnerable people, because I think that there's a lot of those people out there, and I think that the people in those small areas are able to recognize some of that work a whole lot better than we can, as a bigger group. So I'm not opposed to some of the funds being allocated to some of the electoral areas to ensure some of that good work does continue. And I think that we do have time. We have time before we have to use the funds, and certainly all we have to do is have them allocated. So I don't think that there's a huge rush in deciding where these funds go. So I think that I would agree with the directors that have spoken about having a little bit more justification around how we do allocate those funds and what makes the most sense for all of us as a TNRD group. So thank you.
Thanks, Director Smith. Director Kershaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I totally agree with splitting up the vote to 1 and 3 and 2 and 4. And I guess in my area, I've been lucky because I totally support the community hall business. I've already hopefully been allotted some funds to go back to the Littleport Community Hall that have shown me a shortfall from their last year's budget to this year's budget. And I totally agree with Director Rothenberger that let's not get too carried away on this. I think if it qualified for gas tax, it should qualify for what we're doing here. They both go hand in hand. So I support us doing the low and do it as rural directors, not all this other that we get so carried away worrying about what everybody else thinks. Let's just do what's right. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Kershaw. Director Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of things I'd like to mention. One is that when I read the criteria, and that kind of back and forth with questions and answers was really quite helpful in the report. It sounds like it's quite a permissive list of criteria. We really have the obligation to report, but in terms of what we use it for, as long as we can ourselves, with all sort of integrity, link it back to COVID impacts, I think we're going to be okay. So I would just sort of say the province is not going to claw back money, I don't think, from this. It's going to be really a question of, meeting our constituents down the road and saying, here's what we spent money on, and it's up to you whether you think it was a good idea or not. I would also say that I really do believe that electoral directors have the best sense of what's happening in their areas, and I also believe that since I've been around the EA directors have been very, very responsible and very, very good for their constituents, spending the money in the right places. So as Dr. Rothenberger said, the board has never really got in the way of that, generally speaking. And as municipal director, I think it would be not a good idea for that to happen from my perspective anyways. So EA directors have a really important role in rural areas across the region. And lastly, I would just say that I haven't heard anything about some of the big impacts I think COVID's had on the region, which is tourism. And I wonder whether there's an opportunity for us to kind of think about potentially helping, with some funds around, I'm not sure what it would be, like really awesome, like, art pieces or attractions or something that actually brings people to the region and gives them a chance to sort of go around some of the areas that are maybe less beaten track here, so that when, people come back to be able to travel in the province, we have an opportunity to help with that. That's just one idea around something that I've seen as sort of a bit of a not on the list of things that I'm seeing here from staff. But I also want to say that I think staff has had a very challenging job balancing all the different things. And I really appreciate Mr. Ray's work in terms of figuring out what we can and can't spend. And I have a lot of faith in his ability to help us vet, and approve what we're doing. So those are my comments. Sure, thank you.
Thanks, Director Singh. And I want to say thank you also for keeping an eye on who's attempting to be heard. Because from where I'm sitting here, the screen I'm looking at, it's almost impossible to detect the hands waving on many occasions. So I appreciate your help in that regard.
My pleasure.
Director O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm sorry, I was having some technical difficulties this morning. As you probably saw, I was on 2 different Zoom squares here at the same time and trying to log on, but I'm here nonetheless, and I've missed the first little bit. But just a few comments regarding the $100,000 for the pooled economic development services. You know, I think to compare anything to how things were done 15 years ago and wouldn't want to work with venture capitalists with how things were done with KEDCO and BK 15 years ago is a little bit of would be almost a disservice to not explore deeper connections with the largest economic development agency in the area. And if there are synergies, I think before COVID hit, one of the biggest discussions was around the forestry sector and how we were caught blindsided, but at the same time, we were told everybody saw it coming for years behind and we were reacting. So I think investment into economic development for our region as a whole is a very smart, worthwhile investment for our area. And it ends up becoming a legacy of COVID. And not just a quick, let's throw some money at something and you know, we forget about it in a year. This is something that the regional district I believe needs to have and we should have, and we need, you know, I'm not saying it needs to be the same as KEDCO, but figure out a way to make that work for this. And on the construction of the new boardroom, I'm not in favor at this point of spending that money for it. I don't think, again, looking what the city of Kamloops has as our boardroom, that we have the Taj Mahal of the TNRD compared to what we have the city of Kamloops. Our board hasn't grown, and you know, with technology that we have been forced to adapt to for this. So when we do get back to our regular board meeting, we can actually have less people in the boardroom, whether that's staff or some directors still attending virtually as it is. And I just don't think that's a proper use for these funds. So thank you.
Thanks, Director O'Reilly. Director Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It appears we know for sure that Director Riley has a dog. Going to the letter that was dated from the Deputy Minister to Mr. Hildebrand on the 22nd or 21st of March or whatever it was, on page 2, there's a series of bullets of what we might be able to do. Can anyone give me a definition of what other related costs are?
Mr. Ray?
Well, that has been the subject of much debate. It appears that it was put in by the ministry so that the list is broad and not necessarily exhaustive of all possibilities. They want to leave, my reading of the language and from what I've been hearing, they want to leave a lot of discretion in the hands of the board of directors. Having said that, they still want to have a certain criteria or consideration around COVID and the problems. You know, they want to see a link between COVID and what we're doing with the money. But they don't profess to have a crystal ball that understands or predicts every single instance of what those problems might be. So it's fairly broad.
That kind of leaves the door wide open for innovative thinking. Thank you, Mr. Ray.
Director Christian?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Ray. You know, we have a lot of debate about businesses suffering and taxpayers suffering and rural areas suffering and small municipalities and Kamloops. Everybody's suffering. Have we given any thought to using the COVID money to reduce taxes?
That's one thing that was strictly prohibited in the letter. If I try and find that section. and I can't remember if it was in the letter itself or in some of the Q&A from the with the ministry.
But you're confident of that it is strictly prohibited, Director Ray?
It is.
Okay, I think that answers Director Christian's question. Director Christian?
Well, just supplemental to that, in the city of Kamloops, we received COVID restart funding, and we used that to offset things that were allocated in the budget so that the citizens of Kamloops had a reduction in their taxes. So, I mean, while they say specifically that it's not to be directed to the mill rate, I think that you could use it to redirect it to elements of the budget that we're currently taxing for, and therefore provide that sort of broader relief across the taxpayers of the regional district.
I take your point, Mr. Hildebrand.
I just wanted to mention that Director Stamer, I think, is the only one left on my list that had their hand up.
Well, my list is longer. Director Duty.
Thank you, Chair. This conversation today seems to have more to do with allocation of the funds than it does on specific spending. And I think that's as it should be, because it's a pretty broad area with a whole lot of broad challenges and things like that. And I, for one, sitting in Kamloops, have absolutely no idea what the needs or the challenges in each electoral area are, much less those for the other municipalities that are around. So allocation is one thing. How they spend it specifically is not something I can decide. Perhaps if they brought us a business case to the board, asking us to effectively ratify what their needs are, then we could do that at that point in time. However, the other thing that I think that we need to keep in mind with regard to this money is that the public is watching us all the time, and optics are at the forefront with regard to how we spend this money. And so while it may be all right to put the funding towards a town hall and that, I'm not sure that I agree with putting it into a new boardroom. But then to also, echo what Director Smith had said, is that if we're spending in one area to help a segment of our communities to get out of this COVID pandemic area, we're freeing up a whole lot of money that could be allocated to things like the boardroom by not specifically spending COVID relief money on the boardroom, but by freeing it up in another area.
Thanks, Director Duty. That leaves Director Watson and I think Director Stamer, but Director Stamer has already spoken. Director Watson?
And I will pass.
Okay, thank you. I think that covers it unless there's somebody else who wishes to speak to this matter. Okay, so we have in front of us 4 recommendations. And 2 of them have been combined, number 2 and number 4, so that I would suggest, correct me if I'm wrong, that number 4 should be eliminated. Number 2 should now read $179,000 to TNRD, Pooled Economic Development Services, and other regional support. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thanks, Ms. Campbell. So with respect to resolution number 1, $150,000 to electoral areas, bracket, in addition to the $100,000 already allocated, topping each electoral area up to $25,000 each in total. This whole bundle was moved. Should we start over again, Ms. Campbell, and move each one of these and second it as we go along? I think we have to.
I would suggest that, yes.
Thank you. Okay, so does anyone wish to move recommendation number 1?
Move recommendation number 1.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion with respect to recommendation number 1? Director Rain.
Yeah, is it very clear that this is in spending on eligible COVID-related costs as outlined by the province?
We can't understand that,
Yeah, I think that was discussed at quite some length, that it has to fit within the criteria of the provincial government's letter, as outlined in the provincial government's letter relating to COVID. Yes, Director Rain.
I'm fine with that then. I was going to make an amendment, but I'm fine with the acknowledgement by the board.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion on recommendation 1? I see none. All in favor? Is anyone opposed? Director O'Reilly, are there any others?
Director Blackwell.
Pardon?
Director Sinclair, Blackwell, O'Reilly. I'm saying
Okay.
opposed.
And that's noted.
It is.
Thank you. The resolution's passed. Now, with respect to resolution number 2 and 4, which would allocate $179,000 for TNRD pooled economic development services and other regional support. Is there a mover?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Director Watson.
This still is ambiguous and other regional support and economic development services. We have, as a board, worked really hard to stay out of economic development, unfortunately. So I'm not sure that I can support this.
Okay. Is there any further discussion?
Director Singh and I.
Director Singh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really think that this is, I mean, the TRD is an economic development in the sense that we have a film commission, that we have committees that work on various things. If you look at even what I mentioned earlier, my comments around tourism, there has been a massive impact on tourism in the region. And so what I would suggest is that, I mean, I agree with Director Watson that it is vague, but it does give us the opportunity to fill in that, fill in the work plan. And I would just even refer to our strategic plan that we did as a board and pull things out of there that we can use to kind of be able to actually, fund. So even if it's signs, which I'm not a big fan of, but I mean, signs are part of our strategic plan. So, there's stuff there that's actually, I think, good grist for the mill. And I will support the recommendation. I think Director Blackwell and Dr. Sinclair as well, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Director Blackwell?
I think Director Sinclair was first, but if she doesn't mind, I'll go forward. Why are we allocating this now? I mean, we have until December 31st to allocate this, and I believe till the end of 2022 to spend this. I think it's a little bit premature to even put this into a vague category. District of Clearwater has set aside funds that we cannot directly at this point find a use for, because we recognize that the pandemic is ongoing and new needs may come up in months to come that aren't foreseen at this point. I don't understand the rush to go forward with allocating this now. That's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Sinclair, and I apologize if I got you out of order.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, will approving this amount today result in staff coming back with a detailed report, which we then have an opportunity to discuss, or is it blanket allocating $179,000 to economic development, and then staff does or areas do what they want with it? I just need more detail, and that's also why I voted against the previous motion. I'm not opposed to these at all. I just need to see more detail. Thank you.
Mr. Hildebrand.
To Director Sinclair, that this will all go to the board, and we'll certainly have a backup plan with some more detail.
And I have a further question, Mr. Hildebrand, myself, and I think the board would be interested to know, these amounts, are they, once we've allocated them, are they necessary? Is that necessarily cast in stone, or is there room down the road, if as many people have mentioned, the COVID situation continues to develop in many unexpected ways, is there going to be room for movement with, of course, the board's approval? So that we might say, well, down the road, we can't do $150,000 to electoral areas because look what has just cropped up here, there, or somewhere else. Is it possible that this can be altered in the future if necessary?
I would agree, Mr. Chair, that we need to be completely flexible with this. Everything needs to come back for the board for final decision, but unless something's different, Mr. Ray, that you would need to add, but I think flexibility would be important with this funding.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, in my opinion, even the requirement to do the allocation by the end of the year, I believe is simply the province trying to create a sense of urgency to see the funds be used rather than sitting in a bank account still years from now, because there are people who have immediate needs. And I think that allocation deadline was really set to try and make sure that the local governments are making decisions in a timely basis on this. But I don't think that there's anything that I can see that doesn't say that the allocation is completely at the discretion of the board, that you can allocate it today and change your mind tomorrow, reallocate it differently. I think that's acceptable.
There was nothing we could do.
And I would reiterate what Mr. Hildebrandt said in terms of, I think there's a difference between the allocation and a general sense of what areas staff could be working on developing ideas in. But I would think that certainly there would be a report coming back to the board before the money is actually spent to provide more detailed information on how it's going to be used and detailed plans for board approval.
Thanks, Mr. Ray. Is there any further discussion about directors? I'm sorry, Director Elliott and Ms. Campbell, you had.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to follow up on what Mr. Hildebrand said and Mr. Ray, and just remind everyone that the board's sitting as committee of the whole right now. So the recommendation is that committee of the whole recommend these allocations to the board. So whatever comes out of this fulsome discussion will go to the board again for further discussion and debate.
Thank you. Director Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering if you took economic development out of that sentence, then we're not allocating it directly to economic development, because I've been thinking about the fact that Mr. Story has been doing a lot of work on the connectivity within this regional district for the outlying areas. And if we just had it as a regional support amount instead of strictly economic development, I think it would make more sense to all of us. I can make it as an amendment if you wish, but I just.
Well, it would have to be made as an amendment, and I think what we originally agreed sort of informally was that we would combine the two.
Well, that's okay. I just want to take economic development out of it.
Well, are you proposing an amendment to that effect then?
Sure. No, I'm not going to second it.
We're waiting for a seconder.
Mr. Chairman, is that contrary to the amendment to take wording out of it? Is that contrary to the motion?
I don't believe it's contrary, but it the original suggestion was to combine economic development and regional support, but I don't think there's anything preventing Director Elliott from making a motion to remove the economic development services out. You can vote on the amendment and see where it goes.
If I don't get a seconder, I'm fine.
It's already been seconded, Director Elliott.
Okay, thank
you. Any discussion?
Mr. Chair, you have on the screen here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I haven't been using video because our connectivity up in the valley, quite frankly, sucks. But I just wanted an opportunity to make a couple of points, and I agree with Director Blackwell. You know, we can park these funds. We don't have to be spending it right now. As Mr. Ray alluded to, the government's trying to force it down our throats. Well, we have to balance our budget.
I'm
right? The
sorry,
provincial government doesn't
Director
balance the
Kramer,
budget.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're discussing the amendment
Oh,
that
sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Director Elliott put forward. The amendment was to remove economic development from.
That's fine. That's fine, Mr. Chair.
Did you have a question with respect to?
No.
Okay. Sorry,
Director Rain and Director Smith, I believe.
Director Rain.
I believe Director Smith is ahead of me, but if it's all right, I just wanted to clarify. We said that the government's putting this pressure on us. In the Q&A, it says there is no time limit in the regulations creating this grant. The province anticipates local governments will use the money through both the COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 recovery periods, 2020, 2021, and maybe 2022. Just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, thank you. Director Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the amendment, if the amendment if economic development is removed from the motion, and it's just basically a reserve fund that we can allocate as things come up, then I'd be in support of the amendment. But if it's to be allocated right away to one specific purpose, then I would.
No, I don't, as I understand it, is not to be allocated to one specific purpose. It's just now would read $179,000 to other TNRD regional support.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I can support it if it's for items that come up sort of along the way.
Is there any further discussion with respect to the amendment? Director Duty.
Just for clarity's sake, I would assume that other regional support could very well include economic development.
Yeah.
I expect it could, yes.
May I clarify, Mr. Chairman? I wanted that to read what Director Smith said, that 179,000 to TNRD pooled services for other regional support, which means we can use it for other things. As far as I'm concerned, this motion says we're going to use it for economic development.
Okay, I really frankly don't see the point of the whole exercise, because if economic development can still be included, then the original motion would have said $179,000 to TNRD pooled economic development services and other regional support. And now what we've got is just $179,000 to TNRD pooled services and other regional support, which includes economic development. So
but it doesn't include
the whole thing,
anything else.
in my humble opinion, is bogus. But in any case, we're dealing with this amendment, which takes out the words economic development. And is there any further discussion on that? Director O'Reilly?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the fund started at $1.4 million. I think this is showing that we are being proactive for the economic development and the jobs in the entire region. And it's not a quick Band-Aid solution. You know, the other stuff we've allocated money to be helping, you know, for the different electoral areas. We put money towards people that need money now to keep going. This is a longer term strategic investment in economic development in the entire region. And again, it's you know, 179,000 out of the $1.4 million. I think this is a very well balanced approach to say that we want to focus on figuring out a long-term strategy on how we help the economy in the region. And so I will not be supporting this amendment.
Thanks, Director O'Reilly. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, all in favor of the amendment? 1, 2.
Director Elliott and Director Watson.
That's all I see.
Okay,
The amendment fails. That takes us back to $179,000 to TNRD Pooled Economic Development Services and other regional support. Is there any further discussion on that?
I'm sure you have Dr. Stamer.
Director Stamer.
Director Stamer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I got off track a little bit. Yeah, I don't know why we seem to be in such a big rush. I agree with Director O'Reilly that, you know, there's going to be probably some other things that we're going to have to be looking at to help fund in the next 6 months. And we seem to be in a big panic to just disperse all these funds. And again, like I mentioned with Mr. Ray, yeah, and as Director Rain correctly pointed out, there's not supposed to be a hurry in this. Is that, you know, we do have to balance our budget. They don't. And they seem to be able to have a shotgun approach in so many cases. And then the money's gone. And then we have no way of really able to not necessarily justify it, but able to really make some good with it. So, you know, I don't see any reason, as Director Blackwell has stated, why we can't be putting this money aside to the fall. And the same thing is talking about the multi-purpose room. You know, whether we fund that room through regular taxation or we end up using the COVID funds, I think we should just wait and see what's necessary. And come the fall, if it makes sense and the public believes that we're on the right track with what we're doing, because it seems like everybody's really worried about the perception out there of everything that is being done, then maybe we should be having that conversation, find out exactly what we need once the dust hopefully settles by the fall, and then we can make an informed decision on what we would do with the remaining monies. So I'm going to support this, but I'm also going to be probably not supporting the 412 to the boardroom. I'd just as soon keep it parked for the time being, and then we can decide in the fall exactly how to finish spending this money. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Stamer. The 412 to the multi-purpose room will be the next thing on the agenda, but it's being considered separately.
I understand that, Mr. Chair, but it's very hard to talk. We've got so many people, and you raise your hand and you don't get an opportunity to speak, and I certainly don't want to be out of queue. I just wanted to make my point. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Stamer. Is there any further discussion with respect to the combined resolution 2 and 4? Seeing none, all in favor? 2, 3, 4, 5 here. Opposed, if any? 1.
Director, okay, 1 second. Director Watson, Director Elliott, Director Blackwell, Director Smith, and Director Bass.
I'm also opposed.
Are there any?
Director Polderman is also opposed. Thank you.
And Director Rice, you get him?
Director Rice.
So, sorry. We've
Director,
got Director Watson, Director Elliott, Director Smith, Director Bass, Director Polderman, and Director Rice.
and Director Blackwell.
And Director Blackwell. So the motion passes. That brings us to what I thought was going to be the contentious one, which is number 3, $412,000 to be reserved for the construction of a new multi-purpose meeting space, should the board choose that as an option.
I so move.
Moved. Seconded. Discussion.
Director Rain.
Director Rain.
Sorry, I would move that we defer this decision till the fall. Or even till October. And that would give us then the ability to have a full assessment on the impacts of COVID-19 in our area.
I'll second that.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I would just point.
What I think the board needs to understand is if Director Rain's motion is approved to defer consideration of this until the October meeting, that $412,000 sits in advance until that time. Is that correct? I mean, obvious, it makes sense that it should.
Mr. Chair, I just also want to point out that this 412,000 is already currently sitting as per direction from the board at the last board meeting. So we can certainly add some more clarity and detail around that with Director Rain's motion that it specifically be deferred until the fall, but it currently already is deferred. We were just bringing it back to this meeting for further discussion.
So then I take it that all Director Rain's motion would do is add some specificity to that is now not deferred indefinitely. It's deferred until our October meeting. Is that correct?
Correct.
Is that suitable, Director Rain? Director Rain's good with that. Is there any further discussion of Director Rain's motion to defer consideration until the October meeting?
Brown.
Do we actually debate on a deferral or do we just vote on a deferral?
I think actually we just vote on it. Do we not, Director or Ms. Campbell?
Are you are you making a motion to table it or to actually defer it? If you,
I think it's to be deferred.
it's a motion to defer it. So I mean, you can debate it. I mean, it's still
Right.
a motion.
A motion to table is not debatable.
That's right.
Okay, but a motion to defer is debatable?
Yes.
Okay, so we could have further discussion on that. Thank you, Director Brown. Is there any further discussion on Director Rain's motion to defer consideration of resolution number 3 until our October meeting?
Director Roden, do you have your hand up? Nope.
No, hearing none. All in favor of the.
No, Dr. Rowan did have her hand up.
Oh, yes, sorry, I did. I was
Roden.
trying to unmute Director Smith and it wasn't working. Sorry. Would this be, I'm just asking Ms. Campbell, would this be the place to add an amendment that when it comes back, it is also accompanied by a business plan for the new boardroom?
Sure. And Director Roden, I think you could probably make a friendly amendment. We could just add that on if Director Rain is comfortable with that.
Okay, then I would like to make an amendment that when it returns in October, that it is accompanied by a business plan outlining the needs for a new boardroom.
Director Rain, are you okay with that?
Yes, in principle. However, if we got into a situation where we decide by the fall, we thought the funds should be used for other purposes for COVID, I would hope that we then wouldn't be doing a business plan. But if nothing else comes up and we get to the October meeting and it's coming back to the board, then with a business plan. But I think we should still be open to the idea that we don't know exactly all of the outcomes of COVID-19 and we should be flexible.
Yes, and my understanding, Director Rain, is that it would still be open to the board to scotch the whole thing when it comes before the board in October. So I think that it would address your concern there. Mr. Hildebrand?
Just to add to that for clarification, and if we do get word on grant funding, of course, that would change this whole thing and we would bring that back. And so we'll see what we receive in the next few weeks.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion on the motion to defer until October? I see none. All in favor? Is anyone opposed? I can't see anyone from here. Is it?
I can't see anyone either.
Okay, so that passes. We defer consideration of that until October. And I think what we'll do now is take a break before we move on to the territorial land acknowledgement. 10 or 15 minutes.
Hey, Merlin, Bigfoot there, buddy.
Okay, we are back in session. That takes us to, where does it take us to? I lost my page. Item number 2, which is the territorial land acknowledgement, and I believe Mr. Hildebrand has a comment or two to make before we embark on that.
Thank you, Chair Gillis. Good morning again, everyone. Just before we get started in the conversation, I would like to take the opportunity to provide the board with an update on some recent conversations with our First Nations partners that I've had. In anticipation of this important topic, I thought it would be important to reach out to Kamloops, the Secwepemc colleagues, which included Chief Casimir, Shannon Squires, who is the intergovernmental affairs person, Alicia John, Executive Secretary to the Chief and Council, and Ted Gottfredson, which is the Culture and Language Liaison. They were all great conversations, and they provided me with some amazing information, education, local knowledge that would assist the board in determining our path forward. I know Ms. Campbell can also speak to some of the comments and the research she's done in the report, but here are just a few points that I felt were important to share with the board. So firstly, acknowledging and recognizing our First Nation communities, where the board is physically meeting is critical. We certainly can mention that we work with many First Nation communities across the regional district, but our focus should be on the local First Nation community, that being to Kamloops. I have provided each of you an example of an acknowledgement that was shared with me last week. It's in your electronic file. It provides us with a framework and suggestion that our local First Nation community has provided to other community and government agencies in and around the region. And I'm going to read it here, do my best to read it here as well. One very important point that came out of my conversation with Ted was how he referred to the 17 First Nations that represent the Secwepemc territory as campfires. The term campfires, or individual First Nation communities that represent this territory, was commonly used by elders. And he specifically mentioned his mother using that term, and his grandmother, I'm sorry, using that term regularly, and it's becoming more and more common. So the territorial acknowledgement that they sent to me, that I'll read out here now, that I've shared with the board, would be, and I've added the point in about our vast regional district. I said that the TNRD would like to acknowledge that we connect with many First Nation communities across our vast regional district, and today are located at the Kamloops to Secwepemc territory, situated within the unceded traditional lands of the Secwepemc Nation. The TNRD appreciates the partnership that we have with the Kamloops to Secwepemc and respect their territory and land on which we gather here today. So they were hoping that might be a good starting point for what we would acknowledge at the beginning of our meetings. And just a quick side note as well, in addition to this recent conversation, I was also had a discussion with Chief Casimir and Shannon Squires, as well as Carrie Jo Fortier from the Simph First Nation, with regards to setting up an informal meeting of some board members and council and staff, just to have an informal get together to really kind of start the engagement process that we've built into our strategic plan. We're working on setting up an informal meeting, and part of that informal meeting would be discussing how we can actually set up a more formal C2C meeting and really start working on our relationship together. So just a few comments to start the discussion today.
Thanks, Mr. Hildebrand. We have a recommendation.
Move the recommendation.
Moved by Director Duty. Seconded by Director Laird. Is there any discussion? I'm seeing none. Do you see any?
Mr. Chair, it's Arjun Singh here. So the recommendation just reads we're providing input. So are we going to adopt what Mr. Hildebrand has suggested as our acknowledgement. I'm very happy with that. I'm happy to add that to the motion if that's something that the board would like to see, but I think we have to have some direction beyond just receiving for input. So maybe an amendment could be, we would just, I would move that we adopt our CAO's suggested land acknowledgement and get it on the table.
Second that.
I'll just
Campbell?
speak to that. Director Singh, yeah, so Scott did this follow-up and consultation after this report was written. Otherwise, we would have included that
Understood totally. Just wanted to.
recommendation. And I like that, Director Singh. I'm quite happy with having that put forward, and the board can vote on that and discuss that. And the recommendation would be that the committee of the whole recommend that the board adopt this, and then we could just bring it to the board at the May meeting.
So the committee, Ms. Campbell, the committee of the whole, then the amendment would read that the committee of the whole is recommending that the board adopt the introduction as detailed by
The
Mr.
land
Hildebrand.
acknowledgement example,
The
yeah, we
acknowledgement,
can
yeah.
get that worded properly. And it doesn't need to be an amendment. It could just be a motion on its own, because the motion in the report was really just to get some feedback from the board.
Okay, and the feedback from the board, if the amendment is adopted, would be that we recommend the acknowledgement as articulated by Mr. Hildebrand.
Yes, yeah,
Okay, good.
exactly. And Mr. Chair, if I may, I might just speak to some of, as I mentioned, the research that I did.
Certainly.
Yeah, so another regional district was embarking on this research and reached out to me, and I asked if I could sort of piggyback on the research that they were doing. So I provided that chart. And it's of those regional districts that responded, the majority of them do provide a territorial land acknowledgement. The type of which Mr. Hildebrand has mentioned, which is to acknowledge the lands on which you're actually meeting. And those who haven't moved towards this are looking into moving towards it. So it is quite common. And definitely the theme from most of them in the feedback was that it might seem like a really small step, but it's a really small but very significant and important step. And as I mentioned in the report, this really feeds into and informs our strategic plan around First Nations engagement and partnership. So I think it's a really good place for us to start to get things moving with that element of our strategic plan.
Thanks, Ms. Campbell. Is there any further discussion with respect to the amendment proposed? Director Brown?
It doesn't matter whether it's the amendment or not. I'm looking at a couple of things. Is one of them, I'd like to make sure that we put traditional territory as part of the language. But I'm also, all of us are in our own communities right now, and it doesn't include for me just, I don't know how you pronounce that, Schwepnik territory. My territory that we are in here and that I'm on this video virtual thing, Zoom, is different than where you are in Kamloops. So is there any way we can acknowledge more than just Kamloops?
Mr. Hildebrand?
Oh, Director Brown, I can speak to it, and then Mr. Hildebrand could probably speak to it. I can follow up because I know that there's some regional districts actually that are in the same situation as us where they're meeting actually entirely virtually. So they've come up with an alternative acknowledgement recognizing that their directors are we're meeting via Zoom and meeting in other areas. So Mr. Hildebrand can probably expand on that a bit more too.
Well, a supplemental, and even if we're not by Zoom, we still are part of a different territory.
Yeah, and that was to Director Brown, that was my exact conversation here locally. And they told me to be careful with that because it's where we host our meetings and where the regional district is based, because I had the same question as a lot of our board members represent all corners of our vast regional district. And that's why I kind of added that part into the acknowledgement as well. If we potentially had a meeting in Chase or we had one in Merritt or something like that, we would obviously change it to that local acknowledgement, land acknowledgement as well. So it's certainly something that I was aware of when I had the conversation and something that we can adjust as required.
Thanks, Mr. Hildebrand. Is there any further discussion? I see
Director Sinclair.
Director Sinclair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a great initiative. I think it's overdue and I'm happy to see it. And I just wanted to say in support of, the initiative to recognize the land that the meeting is held on. I think that's the right way to go. And if other directors are tuning in from other areas, I think that if they feel it's important, they can acknowledge their traditional territory that they're meeting from that day as well. It's become quite a common practice, and I'm just thinking that maybe one way to support the Indigenous groups in other areas.
Thank you, Director Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have hosted a meeting before COVID with Simp First Nation on the Little House Warriors. So if I were to acknowledge the Simp First Nations traditional territory, which I'm quite happy to do, what kind of problems is that going to cause for me if I don't recognize the Little House Warriors who also claim the land and don't recognize the other ones? And it's a really interesting kind of situation. So I'm just going to carry on as I did with recognizing the traditional territory of the Simp First Nation, period. And hopefully right one.
Well, I think Mr. Hildebrand also addressed that question in the sense that he said we acknowledge the land of the people on whose territory we are meeting, and just make passing reference to the fact that our area includes lands of other nations, First Nations.
If Area B is just within the one Simp First Nations campfire.
That is correct, Chair.
Yeah.
Chair Gillis, I just wanted to add too, when I talked about the Secwepemc territory, it includes 17 First Nations. And of course, we have 25 or more First Nations in our regional district. So we would have to acknowledge those where we meet, to your point.
Thank you, Director Watson.
I think that individual directors, if they are coming to the meeting from their home territory, are more than welcome to mention which territory they are coming from in a Zoom meeting, if they want to, but we should all make sure we pronounce it right.
And therein lies the challenge. Is there any further discussion?
Director Rice.
Director Rice?
Yeah, just a quick acknowledgement and thanks to Director Watson for bringing this forward, and maybe a two or 3 day late happy birthday wish to her also. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion?
It's the Director Singh here, Mr. Chairman.
Director Singh?
Yeah, you have Director Brown after that. So I really appreciate Director Watson bringing this up as well. I also appreciate the time it took for staff to do some research, looking into kind of what it looked like, and talking to our Indigenous colleagues is super important. I appreciate that's been done. I'd also say that I've noticed that this is really a reconciliation piece. It's a piece around, and if the board wants to go further in diversity training or Indigenous competency training, those are all good things. I don't think it really, getting involved with the specifics around, land rights and around legal issues is not what we're doing here. We're really just talking about a relationship building, an important acknowledgement piece of the work. So all that more sort of specific work, I think will come, and that'll be challenging some of that work. But I think it's also very important that we're doing this. And again, thank Dr. Watson for raising it. Thanks staff for the work in terms of getting us to the right place in terms of the actual language of the acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion?
Director Brown, I believe, has her hand up.
I just wanted to say that with the First Nations that I work with here, they're not keen on having us pronounce it properly. They're just happy to hear us try. And if we try to pronounce it, they're fine with that.
Thanks, Director Brown. I found the same thing ordering breakfast in Quebec. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none. All in favor? Is anyone opposed? Director Elliott? Are there any others opposed? The motion is carried. And that takes us to item number 4 on the agenda, which is adjournment.
So moved, second.
Thank you. We stand adjourned.